Every story is an experience, one we'll never forget. The nostalgia, the emotions, the chance to relive moments that shaped who we are. Today we step into the journey of Judith Perkins, a story of resilience, adventure, and lessons learned, a journey absolutely worth telling. This is Journey to Pacific, where every story comes to life. Let's get into this.
Hello, my name is Judith Perkins, and I am an author. I have written a book, Journey to the Pacific, One Man's Quest. I live in Tacoma, Washington, with my husband of 57 years. We have 3 sons, and each one was very intelligent and married wonderful women. And between them, they have given us 7 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. I was born and raised in Portland, Oregon. I went to elementary school, high school, and college there. And after college, I went to work in the retail business. And I worked there for 10 years before I met my husband. And when we were married, his job took us to Southern California. So we lived there for 2 years, and then we moved back to Portland. And after 2 years in Portland, we moved to Great Falls, Montana. And after a few months in Billings, Montana, we moved to Calgary, Alberta. And from Calgary, we moved to Tacoma, Washington. And when we moved to Tacoma, Washington, my son finished the first grade after being in 6 different schools. So I said, no more moving. And we've been in Tacoma for 50 years. In 2000, we retired and bought a motorhome and traveled all over the United States and have the privilege of being in all 48 lower states. What a great experience that was. Our youngest son was in the Air Force, and he was stationed in Texas, in North Carolina, and in Nevada. And so we planned trips to go see him and his family, and we're very fortunate to be able to see all of the other states in between the times. We were always drawn to the national parks. We had a national parks passport, and it was a lot of fun to go into the visitor center and get that stamp on the national parks passport. We planned our trips so that we got to see as many of the national parks as we possibly could. After a while, we decided we were tired of traveling so much, and so we decided to winter in Yuma, Arizona. And we did that for 20 years. Now, since we are older and not able to go to Yuma as easily, we have decided to stay at our home in Tacoma. We enjoy living in our gated community and with all of our friends and neighbors here. I am active in our local Kiwanis Club, serving as its president. Right now, our club is involved in restoring an old school building in our community to be used as a community center. Our community has never had an area or a place where children and adults could go to get the services they need. So we are actively involved in trying to purchase and maintain this old school building. The Kiwanis Club that I belong to also works with the children in our community and in our schools. With the terrific kids programs in elementary schools and the key clubs in high schools, we keep busy doing this rewarding work. It keeps us out and about in our community and keeps me young at heart. When I turned 80 years old, I was sitting at my kitchen table thinking about all of the people who had gone before me and all of the women who had lived up until their 80s or beyond. When I was born, I had a great-great-grandmother, 2 great-grandmothers, 2 grandmothers, a grandfather, a mother, father, and a brother. I was 2 years old when my great-great-grandmother died, 10 years old when one great-grandmother died, and 20 years old when the other great-grandmother died. So I was very fortunate to know my great-grandmothers well. I would sit with my great-grandma and listen to the stories that she told about growing up in a small town in eastern Washington called Riparia. Riparia was located on the Snake River. It was the end of a railroad line for two different railroads, and it was also a shipping port. The hotel was owned by my great-great-grandfather. He was also the postmaster, and he was the mayor of the town for a while. My grandmother was the cook in the restaurant in the hotel, and all of my great-grandma's siblings, 4 sisters and 1 brother, were born and raised in Riparia and worked in the hotel. The hotel was the hub of the town, and all of the people came there. The railroad, when the railroad lines would trains would stop, all of the workers would go into the hotel and stay for the night and eat at the restaurant. My great-grandma would serve them meals. Boats would dock at the landing and unload goods to be sent by rail to other parts of the country. Nano, our nickname for my great-grandma, would sit and tell me stories about the Indians bringing wild game into the hotel to be served to the guests. They would bring elk and deer and pheasant and whatever wild game they could find. They would also bring blankets and arrowheads and other trinkets that they would make into the hotel to trade for goods, food, and different clothing items that they would need. She would also tell me stories about being the cook on a tugboat that went down the Snake River and into the Columbia, and how the Indians would jump onto the tugboat and ride down the Columbia to Celilo Falls, where they would fish for salmon. Celilo Falls was a big salmon fishing area for all of the Indians. I would often wish that I had lived in those times and could experience all of the things that she experienced. She made it sound like so much fun and so exciting. As I was sitting there at my kitchen table with that cup of tea, I got to thinking that I was the last in my line. There was no one else alive that knew any of these stories that she told me. And if I didn't write them down, they would be lost, and my children and grandchildren and my great-grandchildren would not know their heritage. So I decided to write, and I wrote about my ancestors and the town of Riparia. I wrote about my grandfather working on the railroad and stopping in Riparia and meeting my grandma, and how they eventually married, and how my mother was born there in Riparia. And I wrote about my mother growing up during the Depression and living in the Willamette Valley in Oregon. I wrote about my grandfather working for the railroad during the Depression and having jobs for maybe 1 week or 2 weeks and being bumped and had to move to another job. I wrote about my childhood with my brother. I wrote about my school years and my work years and meeting my husband Alan and getting married and having our children. And then I wrote about the challenges of raising those 3 boys with very little money. I wrote about our travels in our motorhome and about how we wintered in Arizona. And that was my first book, Life and Love Continue. After the memoir was published, I did not want to stop writing. I had the bug, but I didn't know what to write about. I thought about all kinds of different subjects and just couldn't come up with a good idea. And then one night I thought, why not use my ancestors' experiences and write a novel about that? So I just started writing again, and the stories just poured out of me. I would get up in the middle of the night with an idea or a thought and have to go into my den and write it down. I was surprised that I could weave a story about my ancestors' experiences. And that was Journey to the Pacific, One Man's Quest. The book is about a baby named George Seevers, who was born just before the Civil War started. He was born late in life to his parents, who had two older teenage boys. When the Civil War started, both of the teenage boys wanted to join the army and serve and do battle with the South. Their father felt honor-bound to join also, and so he went off to war just a couple months after his sons did. He was thinking that probably they would all be home in 2 or 3 months, the war would be over, and they wouldn't have to worry about anything else. Unfortunately, both of the boys were killed within 2 months of leaving home, and George's father got dysentery and died just a couple months later. George's mother was in shock and could not take care of him, so he was placed in the county orphanage. It was a cruel place for children to live. He was made to work from the time he was 3 years old. He started out in the laundry, sorting clothes to be washed, and then he washed clothes on an old washboard in very hot water. Here was a 3-4-year-old boy doing this hard labor, and if he didn't do it well, he was whipped, or he was deprived of a meal. After he finished in the laundry, he was moved to the kitchen. He had grown enough so that he was able to clean off tables and do dishes. Again, he was working in very hot water. After a while, he was taught how to cook. They needed help cooking the meals in the kitchen. So he was taught how to cook in large quantities to feed all of the children, and he became quite a good cook. One of George's side jobs was to keep the visitors' waiting room clean. It was a room where people came that were interested in adopting children. They waited until the children came to show them the children so that they could decide whether they wanted to adopt them. In that room were magazines and newspapers and periodicals, and it was George's job to keep them all straight and neat and clean, to make sure that there was no trash laying around. He was fascinated by the looks of the books, of the magazines, and by the pictures on the front of the magazines. And one day a kind matron took pity on him and decided to teach him how to read. Reading became George's lifeline. He read everything he could get his hands on. He read a story about the Pacific Ocean and the salty water and the vastness of the scenery and the ocean. And it became his life's dream and his ambition to one day see the ocean and to taste that salty water. By the way, the Oregon coast and the Pacific Ocean has always been a big draw for me and my family. I consider it my happy place, and I go there as often as I possibly can. Back to the story of George. George was not a tall boy, but he was very strong. In the orphanage, if the children were not told what they were to do, they were whipped, and George did not like to get whipped. And he did not like to lose any meals either. He liked to eat. George always did as he was told, so he wouldn't get that whipping, and so he could eat. But he got very, very tired of seeing the younger children getting hurt. Because he was strong and able to work hard, he was moved to the fields, to work in the fields, to push a plow in the hard soil, to cultivate it and to get it ready for planting. One day, when George was about ready to turn 15 years old, he decided to run away. He was tired of all of the cruel and unnecessary punishment of all of the children. One evening, while he was in his room, he took all of his belongings, which were very few, wrapped them in a towel and stuffed them into his shirt. And he went out and asked the matron, or told the matron, that he had to use the outhouse quick. He was bent over holding his stomach. And she gave him permission to go, but to come back as soon as he could. So he went to the outhouse and he took everything out of the towel, put on any other clothes that he had, stuffed things into the pockets, put his jacket on, and he left. He heard a train whistle in the background, and he went through the fields in the direction of that train whistle, hoping that maybe he could get on board that train and it would lead him west towards the Pacific Ocean. George has a lot of journey ahead of him to find the Pacific Ocean, and I would like it if you would stay tuned and find out what happens to him and if he does ever get to the Pacific Ocean. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you have enjoyed a glimpse into my life and into the life of George Seevers. See you next time.